You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 3,000 corrupted souls, but the Void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the Void? Now let's jump into today's story. I need to tell you this story before they find me. Before the cross I carved into my palm stops burning, and I lose the will to resist what's calling me back to that chamber beneath Rome. My name is Thomas Bellamy, and I discovered something that will make you question every prayer you've ever whispered, every confession you've ever made. But first, let me tell you about the others who came before me, the ones who tried to warn the world and failed. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a respected archaeologist from the University of Madrid. In 1987, she published a paper about anomalous architectural features discovered during routine maintenance beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The paper appeared in the Journal of Religious Architecture for exactly 3 hours, before every copy vanished from libraries and databases worldwide. Elena herself disappeared 2 weeks later while conducting follow-up research in Rome. The university has no record of her ever existing. Father Michael O'Connell was an Irish priest who worked in the Vatican's secret archives for 37 years. In 2003, he began sending encrypted emails to journalists worldwide, claiming he'd found evidence of systematic doctrinal corruption dating back to the Renaissance. The emails stopped abruptly after 2 weeks. Father O'Connell was found dead in his Vatican apartment, apparently of natural causes, though he was only 49 and in perfect health. His research notes were missing, his computer wiped clean. Professor David Ashworth taught medieval history at Oxford for 22 years. In 2011, he discovered a cache of documents in a private collection that suggested fundamental misrepresentations in official church chronology. He was preparing a book when he suffered what doctors called a complete psychotic break. Ashworth spent his final years in a psychiatric facility, claiming that figures in cardinal robes visited him nightly, standing silently at the foot of his bed with their mouths sewn shut. He died screaming about the 13 who watch and wait. I found their stories buried in obscure archives, hidden in forgotten databases, scattered across the dark corners of the internet where truth goes to die. Each investigator had stumbled across fragments of the same secret. Each had tried to expose it. Each had been silenced, discredited, or erased entirely. I thought I was smarter than them. I thought my experience as an investigative journalist would protect me from whatever institutional power they'd encountered. I was wrong about everything. The Catholic Church isn't what you think it is. It never was. 3 months ago, I was just another freelance journalist scraping by in Rome, writing exposés about Vatican financial scandals that disappeared from websites as quickly as I published them. I specialized in institutional corruption, the kind of stories that powerful organizations spend fortunes to suppress. I thought I was fighting the good fight, exposing hypocrisy in the house of God. What I didn't realize was that my entire career had been carefully orchestrated. Every source who contacted me, every leaked document that found its way to my desk, every tip that led to a breakthrough story, all of it was part of a pattern I was too blind to see. I had no idea I was being groomed. Looking back now, with the terrible clarity that comes from knowledge you wish you'd never gained, I can trace the manipulation back to my childhood. The scholarship that allowed me to attend university, despite my family's modest means. The professor who encouraged my interest in religious mysteries. The editor who gave me my first job investigating church finances despite my complete lack of experience in financial journalism. Even my apartment in Trastevere wasn't random. I thought I'd found it through a rental listing, but now I know it was specifically chosen for me. The previous tenant, an elderly woman named Maria Benedetti, had lived there for 60 years. After she died, her family tried to sell the apartment, but every potential buyer encountered mysterious obstacles. Financing fell through, inspections revealed problems that mysteriously resolved themselves later, legal complications arose and vanished without explanation, until I showed up. For me, everything went smoothly. The paperwork processed without a hitch. The bank approved my application immediately, and the family accepted my offer despite having higher bids from other buyers. They told me later that they felt compelled to sell to me specifically, though they couldn't explain why. Maria Benedetti, I learned from her relatives, had been a devout Catholic who attended Mass every day at the Chiesa di San Bartolomeo alle Sola. But in her final years, she'd become increasingly agitated, claiming that her prayers weren't reaching God anymore. She said the words felt poisoned in her mouth, that something was intercepting them before they could reach heaven. Her family thought it was dementia. I know better now. The apartment came furnished, and among Maria's possessions was a collection of religious artifacts that her family had no interest in keeping. Crucifixes, prayer books, rosaries, the usual accumulation of a lifetime of faith. But hidden among them was something that should have warned me away from this path. A small wooden box containing fragments of old parchment, covered in Latin text. I glanced at them when I moved in, assuming they were just old prayers or biblical passages, but after everything that happened, I went back and translated them properly. They were fragments of Brother Francesco Toretti's original journal, passages that described in horrifying detail what he'd found beneath the Vatican. Maria Benedetti had spent decades collecting these fragments, gathering evidence of the conspiracy that had corrupted her faith. She'd never been able to piece together the full truth, but she'd come close enough to understand that something was terribly wrong with the church she'd devoted her life to serving. The fragments described rituals conducted in chambers that officially didn't exist, ceremonies that perverted every sacred act she'd ever witnessed. They spoke of confessions that fed something hungry in the darkness, of prayers that were harvested like crops to nourish an entity that predated Christianity itself. Maria had tried to warn people, just as Toretti had tried centuries earlier, but who would believe an elderly woman claiming that the Catholic Church was literally feeding an ancient evil? Her own family dismissed her concerns as the ravings of a failing mind. She died alone in the apartment, clutching a rosary that her family later told me had turned black in her hands. They threw it away, along with most of her religious artifacts, keeping only a few items for sentimental value. But they left the wooden box of parchment fragments, probably assuming they were worthless. I think Maria knew what would happen to her apartment after she died. I think she left those fragments deliberately, knowing that whoever was chosen to live there next would need them. She'd spent her final years trying to warn the world about the truth she'd discovered, and when that failed, she'd settled for trying to warn the next person who would be drawn into the conspiracy. It started with the dreams. Every night for weeks before the package arrived, I dreamed of walking through corridors that didn't exist, following voices that spoke in languages I'd never heard. I'd wake with the taste of incense and grave dirt in my mouth, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like old parchment. In the dreams, I was always searching for something. A door, a room, a truth that waited in the darkness below Rome. Sometimes I was alone, sometimes I was accompanied by figures in cardinal robes, whose faces I could never quite see. They would lead me deeper and deeper into passages that seemed to extend infinitely into the earth, past architecture that grew older and more alien with each level. The dreams were always the same, but they grew more vivid each night. I began to recognize landmarks in those underground passages, began to understand the layout of chambers that shouldn't exist. By the time the package arrived, I could have drawn a map of the route from memory. I thought the dreams were just my subconscious processing the stress of my work. The endless cycle of exposing corruption only to watch my articles disappear from the internet. I didn't realize they were memories bleeding through from another version of myself. A Thomas Bellamy who had already made the journey I was about to begin. The package came on a Thursday in early October, left outside my apartment in Trastevere, as Rome's sky turned the colour of dried blood. No delivery service, no return address, just oiled leather that felt warm to the touch and smelled like something that should have been buried centuries ago. Inside were 3 items that would shatter my understanding of reality. A map dated 1610, signed by brother Francesco Toretti. Parchment that felt too smooth, too warm, as if it had been made from something other than animal skin. Scrawled in fading Latin, non omnia patent sacerdotibus. Not all is revealed to the priests. A journal fragment, its pages brittle as moth wings, describing the chapel that devours confessions and the 13 who chose damnation to preserve the lie. And a medallion carved from bone that I knew, with sick certainty, was human. When I touched it, images flashed through my mind. A screaming man being flayed alive, his bones carved while he still breathed, blessed by 13 figures in cardinal robes as his agony sanctified the relic. The map showed passages beneath the Vatican that didn't appear on any modern blueprint. At its heart was a circular chamber marked with words that made my vision blur. Here dwells the true Pope, and the price of his eternal reign. I should have burned it all. Instead, I spent the night researching brother Francesco Toretti, and what I found broke something fundamental in my understanding of history. Toretti hadn't been executed for mapping forbidden areas. He'd been executed for trying to warn the world about what he'd found. The trial records I managed to unearth from deep Vatican archives painted a picture of a man driven to madness by terrible knowledge. He spoke of the thing that wears Christ's face, of 13 tongues cut out to keep one secret, of the Pope who never died, because he was never truly alive. But here's what made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Toretti's execution date was wrong. According to multiple sources, he died in 1610. But I found a letter in his handwriting dated 1847, hidden in a private collection in Florence. The paper was authentic, the ink was period correct, and the handwriting matched perfectly. The letter contained a single sentence: "I have been serving the vigil for 237 years, and I can endure no more." That night, the storm that would later be called the worst in Rome's recorded history began to build. But inside my apartment, as I stared at the bone medallion, a different kind of tempest was brewing in my mind. The carved surface began to glow with pale phosphorescence, and in its light I could see my reflection in the window changing. My face grew gaunt, my eyes sunken, and golden thread appeared across my mouth, stitching my lips shut. The reflection raised one hand to its throat and drew a finger across it in a gesture I somehow understood meant silence unto death. But this time, instead of looking away in horror, I forced myself to maintain eye contact with my reflection. What I saw in those changed features wasn't just a glimpse of a possible future. It was a window into the present reality of another version of myself. The other Thomas mouthed words I couldn't hear but understood perfectly. 312 years, 4 months, 16 days. The length of time I'd been serving the vigil in his reality. The weight of centuries pressed down on me through the glass, and I felt something crack in my mind as I tried to comprehend what that kind of existence would mean. Eternal service, eternal silence, eternal complicity in the corruption of everything I had once believed was sacred. The reflection continued speaking. "Maria tried to warn you. The fragments in the box. She knew what they would do to her apartment after she died. Knew they would place someone here who could be groomed for recruitment. She left those papers hoping whoever came next would be strong enough to resist, wise enough to run. I looked toward the wooden box I'd found among Maria Benedetti's possessions, suddenly understanding why her family had felt compelled to leave it behind. It wasn't accident or oversight. It was her final attempt to save whoever would be chosen to replace her as their unwitting instrument. Racing to the box, I dumped out all the parchment fragments and spread them across my desk. In the medallion's glow, additional text became visible on the papers, written in an ink that only appeared under that unnatural light. Maria's own words, written in shaking handwriting during her final months. They watch this apartment. They've been watching it since the day I moved in 60 years ago. This building sits directly above one of the old paths that channel faith to the feeding chamber below. Every prayer I offered from this apartment was harvested. Every moment of devotion flowed down through the stones into passages that lead to the 13. The young man who will live here after I die has been prepared since childhood. If you are reading this, then you are Thomas Bellamy, and your life has been a lie. Every choice you thought you made freely was guided. Run. Take these fragments and burn them, but first copy down everything you can read. Find others who have escaped their influence. They exist, though they hide in places the 13 cannot reach. The mountains hold some sanctuary. Islands surrounded by moving water offer protection. Anywhere that the old ley lines don't touch. But if you cannot run, if the calling has already taken root in your soul, then remember this. Faith is stronger than institutions. Truth survives even when everything else crumbles to dust. The cross has power they cannot touch, but only if it is carved with genuine belief. Only if it is marked in blood freely given. Her final message was written in dried blood. I tried to escape but waited too long. Look for me among the 13, the only woman among them, still wearing the blue dress I died in. I staggered back from the desk, understanding finally why Maria Benedetti's family had described her final years as a descent into madness. She hadn't been losing her mind. She'd been fighting for her soul, resisting the same calling that was now pulling at me with increasing intensity. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat watching my reflection, and it sat watching me until I could no longer tell which of us was real. The other Thomas aged before my eyes, growing gaunt and hollow as centuries of service took their toll. His cardinal robes appeared gradually, materializing around his frame like shadows taking substance, but his eyes never changed. In them, I could see the man he had been before the vigil claimed him, the journalist who had thought he was fighting for truth and justice. The recognition between us was absolute and terrifying. We were the same person, separated only by the thin membrane between one reality and another. As dawn approached, the other Thomas pressed his hand against the glass from his side, and I found myself raising my own hand to match it. The moment our palms touched, even with the window between us, I felt the full weight of his existence flood into my consciousness. 3 centuries of standing in that chamber below, watching as the 13 performed their eternal duty. Decades of new initiates being brought down for the choosing. Watching as some joined willingly, and others were consumed entirely, erased so completely that reality itself forgot they had ever existed. I saw through his eyes as the ritual was performed on new cardinals, their tongues removed with ceremonial daggers while they still lived, their mouths sewn shut with golden threads spun from the hair of martyred saints. I felt his silent scream as he was forced to participate, his hands guiding the needle as new members were bound to the covenant. And I understood why Brother Francesco Torretti had finally chosen obliteration over continued service. There comes a point where even eternal existence becomes unbearable, where the weight of complicity grows too heavy for any soul to carry. The visions ended as suddenly as they had begun, leaving me gasping on the floor of my apartment with blood running from my nose and the taste of grave dirt in my mouth. The bone medallion had burned a permanent impression into my palm, where I'd been clutching it, marking me in a way that I knew would never fade. When I looked back at the window, my reflection had returned to normal, but now I knew it was only temporary. The other Thomas was still there, still watching, still waiting for me to make the choice that would either save me or damn me. The smart thing would have been to follow Maria's advice. Pack immediately, flee Rome, find sanctuary in places where the old powers couldn't reach. But the medallion's calling was already too strong, the knowledge too compelling. I had to know the truth, had to see for myself what lay in the chamber beneath the Vatican. I had to face the 13 and the thing they served, even knowing that the encounter would either transform me into something I despised or erase me from existence entirely. The next day, driven by compulsions I couldn't explain, I contacted Father Giani Moretti. We'd known each other for years. He'd been my theology professor before becoming a Vatican archivist with access to the deepest restricted collections. Thomas, his voice crackled through the phone, and I could hear something wrong in it immediately. Something that sounded like fear. "I've been expecting your call." "You have?" The dream started 3 days ago. A man in my office pointing to a section of archives I was told never to enter. When I tried to see his face, I realized it was you, but changed. Your mouth was sewn shut, and your eyes held sentries. The silence stretched between us like a gulf. "Father, I found something, a map." "God help us both," he whispered. "Meet me tonight at the Porta Sant'Anna. Come alone, and Thomas. Bring whatever called you to this path. It won't let us turn back now." But before I could meet Giani, I needed to understand more about what I was walking into. The fragments from Maria's box had revealed the scope of the conspiracy, but I needed to know how deep it really went. How many others had stumbled onto the truth over the centuries. I spent the day researching the 3 names I'd found earlier: Elena Vasquez, Father O'Connell, and Professor Ashworth. But this time, I dug deeper, looking for patterns in their disappearances, connections between their research. What I found was a network of silenced voices stretching back centuries. In 1823, a French archaeologist named Henri Dubois published a paper about architectural anomalies discovered during restoration work at Notre Dame Cathedral. The paper appeared in exactly one academic journal before all copies vanished. Dubois himself was found dead in the Seine 3 weeks later, apparently having jumped from the Pont Neuf. But witnesses reported that his mouth had been sewn shut with golden thread. In 1904, an American journalist named William Cross wrote a series of articles for the New York Herald about financial irregularities and occult practices within the Vatican hierarchy. The articles were pulled from newsstands within hours of publication, and Cross disappeared while investigating follow-up leads in Rome. His hotel room was found empty, except for a note written in Latin: "Silentium est aurum." Silence is golden. In 1967, Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a professor of medieval history at Cambridge, began researching what she called persistent architectural patterns in European cathedrals. Her research notes, discovered after her death, described mathematical relationships between confessional placement and acoustic properties that suggest deliberate design for purposes unknown. She died in a car accident 2 days before she was scheduled to present her findings at an international conference. The accident occurred on a straight road in perfect weather conditions. Each case followed the same pattern: initial discovery, brief attempts at publication or exposure, then sudden death or disappearance. But more disturbing was what I found in the margins. Literally. Each researcher had left behind notes written in spaces they thought no one would look. Margins of books, backs of photographs, spaces between official documents. These marginalia told a different story. They described dreams that began weeks before their discoveries, dreams of walking through underground passages and standing before 13 figures in cardinal robes. They wrote about reflections that moved independently, about bone medallions that appeared in their possessions without explanation, about the growing certainty that their entire careers had been orchestrated to bring them to a moment of terrible choice. Dr. Sinclair's final marginal note, written in the back cover of a library book about Gothic architecture, read, "I understand now why they let us discover fragments of the truth. It's not accident or oversight. They need us to find it. The covenant requires willing servants, and true willingness only comes from those who have seen the full scope of what they're choosing to join. We are not threats to be eliminated. We are candidates to be recruited." The implication hit me like a physical blow. Every researcher who had stumbled onto the conspiracy hadn't been an accidental threat. They had been carefully selected, guided to their discoveries, led step by step towards the moment when they would be offered the same choice I was now facing. But why? Why go through such elaborate recruitment when they could simply force people into service? The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching Dr. Sinclair's work, I found a reference to a much older document, a 15th century treatise on the metaphysical properties of consensual versus coercive spiritual servitude. The author was listed as Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, the same name I'd seen in the trial records of Brother Francesco Torretti. I tracked down a copy of the treatise in a private collection in Florence, paying an enormous sum to have it digitized and translated. What I read there explained everything. According to Farnese's research, the entity that fed on human faith could only digest what was freely given. Forced worship, coerced confession, and involuntary service provided no nourishment. The creature required genuine devotion, even if that devotion was ultimately corrupted and redirected. This was why the 13 had to be willing volunteers. This was why each generation of researchers was carefully recruited rather than simply eliminated. The Covenant demanded servants who chose their fate with full knowledge of what they were accepting, but it also revealed something else, something that made my hands shake as I read it. The entity was growing weaker. Each generation, fewer people possessed the kind of deep, genuine faith that could sustain it. The modern world's increasing secularization wasn't just changing society. It was slowly starving the creature that had fed on human devotion for millennia. The 13 weren't just maintaining a vigil. They were fighting a losing battle against time itself, desperately seeking new sources of nourishment for their dying patron. This was why the recruitment process had become more elaborate, why they needed people like me who possessed both investigative skills and, despite everything, a core of genuine belief. I realized with growing horror that I had been chosen not despite my skepticism about institutional religion, but because of it. My articles exposing Vatican corruption hadn't been threats to their power. They had been proof of my usefulness. I could see through the church's lies while still maintaining faith in something greater. I was exactly what they needed, a true believer who was also a skilled doubter. As evening approached and the time for my meeting with Giani drew near, I made one final discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Cardinal Farnese's treatise was a section titled "On the Liberation of Willing Servants." It described a ritual that could potentially free those bound to the covenant, but only under specific circumstances. The ritual required 3 elements: genuine faith, unmarked by institutional corruption, willing sacrifice of one's own spiritual essence, and most crucially, the voluntary participation of one already bound to the covenant who chose redemption over continued service. In other words, escape was possible, but only if someone among the 13 was willing to sacrifice their eternal existence to break the binding for another. I thought of Maria Benedetti's final message, her reference to love enduring even in damnation. Had she been trying to tell me that, she would help me escape if given the chance. Was there still enough humanity left in those who served the vigil to make such a choice? There was only one way to find out. That evening, as lightning split the sky above Vatican City, I met Giani at a service entrance I'd never noticed before. The priest looked as if he'd aged a decade in the hours since our call. His hands shook as he led me through security checkpoints manned by Swiss guards who stared straight ahead, their eyes unfocused, as if they'd been instructed not to see us. But before we descended, Giani pulled me aside into a small chapel I hadn't noticed on any tourist map. "There's something you need to understand before we go down there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been having the dreams for longer than I told you. Not 3 days, 3 years. Every night I see myself standing in that chamber with the 13. And every night I watch you make the choice that will damn or save us both." He showed me his hands. Carved into each palm was a cross, identical to the one I would later carve into my own flesh. "I tried to resist the calling by marking myself with holy symbols," he explained. "But the marks only burn brighter each time I dream of that place. I think they're not protection. I think they're preparation. The entity requires its servants to bear the mark of faith corrupted, and we've been marking ourselves." The realization that Giani had been chosen alongside me, that we were both walking into a trap we'd helped to set, should have sent me running. Instead, it only strengthened my resolve to see this through to the end. "The archives go deeper than most people know," Giani whispered as we descended through levels that grew progressively more ancient. "Much deeper. The foundation stones predate Christianity by centuries. Some say they're part of the original Roman catacombs. Others believe they're older still." As we walked, Giani told me about the other archivists who had worked these deep levels over the decades. Brother Marcus, who had maintained the restricted collections for 40 years, before disappearing one night in 1987. Sister Catherine, who had been found standing motionless in the deepest archive level in 1995, staring at a wall that showed no door, but which she insisted led to the heart of all confessions. Father Rodriguez, who had worked the archives for 30 years before requesting transfer to a remote monastery in 1999, claiming that the books down here whispered to him in languages that predated the Tower of Babel. "They're all still here," Giani said as we passed through increasingly ancient corridors. "Not officially, of course, the church has no record of their continued service. But sometimes when I work late in the archives, I see them, standing in doorways that shouldn't exist, reading from books that appear on no catalogue, tending to collections that officially were destroyed centuries ago." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I think tonight we join them, and I need you to know that if we do, if we accept what's waiting for us down there, we won't be the first Vatican employees to simply continue working. The church has been staffed by the damned for longer than anyone realizes." The electric lights gave way to gas lamps, then to torches that burned with flames that cast no warmth. The frescoes on the walls depicted familiar biblical scenes, but wrong somehow. The Garden of Eden showed Adam and Eve kneeling before a figure whose face was shadow. The Nativity featured wise men offering gifts to something swaddled in darkness rather than light. But it was the modern additions that truly unsettled me. Mixed among the ancient religious imagery were more recent paintings depicting scenes from the 20th and 21st centuries. Vatican II sessions where the attending bishops cast shadows in the shape of twisted creatures. Papal audiences where the faithful knelt before a throne occupied by something that was only wearing the Pope's face like a mask. Most disturbing of all, a painting that showed the current Pope, Francis, standing in what I recognized as the chamber we were approaching, offering communion wafers to the 13, while something immense and tentacled loomed behind him. "Those weren't here yesterday," Giani said, noticing my attention. "The paintings changed to reflect current events. The walls themselves bear witness to each generation's participation in the covenant. In the deepest level, far below the papal crypts, we found the wall from Toretti's map. The stone was different here, black and weathered, covered in a patina that suggested impossible age. A circular indentation marked its surface, and from it emanated air that smelled of decay and burnt offerings. But now I could see what I'd missed in the map's representation. The wall wasn't alone. It was part of a larger architectural feature, a massive stone door that stretched from floor to ceiling, carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. The circular indentation was just the keyhole. The real door was enormous, ancient beyond measure, and clearly designed to keep something in, rather than to keep intruders out. "My God," Giani breathed, "it's not a secret chamber. It's a prison. A prison with a door that can only be opened from the outside." The moment Giani touched the wall, his body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and he began speaking in a tongue that predated human language. The words seemed to come from the stone itself, echoing through his throat like a ventriloquist's dummy. But this time, I could understand what he was saying. The language was older than Latin, older than any human tongue, but the meaning burned itself into my consciousness. The compact nears its end, the feeding grows thin, the watchers grow weary. Fresh blood must renew the covenant, or the bound one will break free to reclaim what was promised before the first human drew breath. When he snapped back to awareness, tears of blood streaked his cheeks. "I saw them," he gasped. "The 13. They're still down there, still waiting. And Thomas, one of them was you. Not as you are, but as you will be. And one of them was me, wearing the robes of an archivist, even in eternal service." He fled then, leaving me alone, with the ancient door and the bone medallion that had begun to burn against my chest like a coal. I knew I should follow him, should run back to the surface and never speak of what we'd found. Instead, I placed the medallion into the circular indentation. The mechanisms that groaned to life had been waiting for centuries. But this wasn't just stone grinding against stone. It was the sound of something immense stirring to wakefulness, something that had been contained but never truly sleeping. The door didn't slide aside so much as it opened like a mouth, revealing a passage that descended at an impossible angle into the bedrock beneath Rome. Torches ignited themselves as I passed, their flames blue and cold, casting shadows that moved independently of my body. The passage spiraled down through stone that grew older with each step. Roman masonry gave way to Etruscan blocks, then to something that predated human civilization entirely. The walls themselves seemed alive, breathing slowly, expanding and contracting, as if the tunnel were the throat of some enormous sleeping creature. As I descended, whispers began to echo from the stone. Not voices speaking, but thoughts bleeding through the walls from minds that had been trapped here for centuries. I heard fragments of confessions, snippets of prayers, the dying words of saints and sinners alike, all flowing together into a stream of human suffering that fed something waiting in the darkness below. The tunnel seemed to descend for miles, though physics insisted that was impossible. But then, I was learning that physics meant nothing in this place where older laws held sway. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking through that living throat, the passage opened into a chamber that redefined my understanding of space itself. The room was vast beyond measurement, its domed ceiling disappearing into darkness that seemed to extend infinitely upward. Yet somehow I could see every horrific detail with perfect clarity. The walls were covered in carvings that rewrote biblical history with surgical precision. The Last Supper showed Christ's disciples feeding on his living flesh while he screamed in divine agony. The crucifixion depicted 3 crosses, but the central figure hanging from the middle cross wasn't Christ. It was a man in papal robes, crowned with thorns made of gold, while the true Saviour knelt below, offering up his own heart on a silver platter. But it was the papal ceremonies that truly broke my mind. Carved in perfect detail with scenes spanning centuries, baptisms conducted with blood instead of water, communion wafers that writhed like living flesh, confirmation ceremonies where children were marked with brands rather than holy oil, every ritual perverted, every sacrament corrupted, every holy act transformed into its opposite. At the chamber's centre stood an altar carved from a single block of obsidian that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface was stained with offerings that had been given over centuries, and around its base lay scattered pages covered in writing that burned itself into my consciousness the moment I looked at them. I could read every word in languages I'd never learned, knowledge flowing into my mind like acid eating through metal. The pages told the true history of the Catholic Church, beginning not with Christ's resurrection, but with something far older awakening in the catacombs beneath Rome. In the year 1484, Pope Innocent VIII faced political upheaval that threatened to destroy everything the Church had built. Desperate to preserve papal authority, he sought power from sources that predated Christianity itself. In the deepest catacombs, where the first Christians had hidden from Roman persecution, something else had been hiding much longer. The entity that answered his prayers was ancient beyond human comprehension, a thing that had fed on faith and suffering since, before the first temple was raised to any god. It offered Innocent a bargain that would ensure the Church's dominance for all eternity, unlimited temporal power, unshakable spiritual authority, and the devotion of billions of souls across the centuries. The price was simple. The Vatican would become a feeding ground. Every confession whispered in its halls would nourish the entity. Every sin hidden in its archives would strengthen it. Every act of faith corrupted by institutional hypocrisy would make it more powerful. But the entity required wardens to maintain the covenant, guardians who would ensure the feeding continued uninterrupted. 13 cardinals volunteered for eternal service, understanding the true cost of what they were agreeing to. They cut out their own tongues with daggers, blessed in the name of their new patron, then sewed their mouths shut with golden thread spun from the hair of martyred saints. Only through their perpetual silence could the entity remain bound, contained but constantly nourished. As long as the 13 maintained their vigil, the creature would content itself with its diet of corrupted faith. But if even one guardian failed, if a single sewn mouth opened to speak the truth, the binding would shatter completely. As I read these revelations, the temperature in the chamber dropped far below freezing. My breath fogged in the air, and the torches dimmed until they barely provided enough light to see. Above the altar, something I had mistaken for a statue began to move. Suspended from the ceiling, by chains that looked more grown than forged, hung the preserved form of Pope Innocent VIII himself. 5 centuries of unnatural life had transformed him into something that was no longer entirely human. His papal robes had rotted into tattered remnants, revealing flesh that was grey and desiccated, but still somehow vital. When his eyes opened, they held the accumulated malice of 500 years. "Welcome, my child," he spoke, and his voice was the sound of grinding bone. "You have come at last to take your place among the chosen." From alcoves carved into the chamber walls stepped 13 figures in cardinals' robes. Their faces were hidden by deep hoods, but I could see that their mouths had been sewn shut with golden thread that gleamed in the dim light. Despite their sealed lips, they spoke in unison, their words echoing directly inside my skull. "Every prayer offered in our churches feeds the covenant," they said with voices that used my own thoughts against me. "Every confession whispered in our sanctuaries strengthens the binding. Every soul that seeks salvation through our sacraments becomes sustenance for our patron." The lead cardinal stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a face I recognized from Renaissance paintings. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, dead for over 400 years, but still very much present. For 5 centuries we have maintained the vigil, his voice continued in my mind. We have fed the entity with the faith of billions, channeled their prayers to something that answers them in ways they could never imagine. The faithful believe they commune with God, but their words reach older ears, ears that remember when the world was young and humanity had yet to dream of salvation. I tried to back toward the tunnel, but the passage had sealed itself. The walls were moving now, closing in like the throat of some enormous beast, preparing to swallow. As I watched in terror, my own reflection began to emerge from the polished surface of the altar, but this wasn't my reflection. It was me, but changed, transformed. His mouth was sewn shut with the same golden thread that bound the cardinals, and his eyes held knowledge that no mortal mind should contain. When he spoke, somehow audible despite his sealed lips, it was with my voice carrying centuries of experience. "You were chosen before you were born," he said, each word cutting through my mind like a blade. "Your parents' meeting, your education, your career as a journalist, all carefully orchestrated to bring you to this moment. Every article you wrote about Vatican corruption, every secret you exposed, was part of a larger pattern designed to prepare you for this revelation." The entity showed me visions of my life that I had never remembered. Moments when I had felt compelled to investigate stories that seemed to find me, rather than the reverse. My childhood obsession with religious mysteries, my inexplicable ability to gain access to restricted archives, my uncanny skill at uncovering secrets that others had spent fortunes to hide, all of it had been orchestrated. "We offer you what few have been granted," the 13 cardinals continued. "Join us willingly and retain your identity, your memories, your sense of self. You will become one of the eternal guardians, a keeper of the greatest secret in human history. You will help maintain the balance that keeps the faithful ignorant and the covenant strong." They showed me the alternative: complete consumption. Not just death, but absolute erasure from existence. Previous victims flashed before my eyes. Archaeologists who had ventured too deep, historians who had asked dangerous questions, priests who had stumbled across fragments of the truth. All had been given the same choice, and those who refused had been devoured so completely that reality itself forgot they had ever existed. Brother Francesco Torretti served faithfully for over 2 centuries. Cardinal Farnese's voice whispered in my mind. His execution was staged, his death fabricated so that he could take his place among the 13. But eventually, even the strongest will breaks. The map you found was his final act of rebellion, before he chose oblivion over eternal service. As the walls continued to close in, I felt the weight of the choice crushing down on me. Join them and become complicit in the systematic corruption of human faith, or refuse and be erased so completely that even God wouldn't remember my name. But then, I remembered something crucial from the journal pages. A detail hidden among the descriptions of the binding ritual. The covenant fears only one thing: the truth spoken in the name of genuine faith, by one who has seen the depth of the deception yet chooses to believe regardless. Using a shard of obsidian that had broken from the altar, I carved a cross into my palm, feeling my blood drip onto the ancient stone. But this wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of defiance. A declaration that even knowing what I now knew, even understanding that my prayers had been feeding something monstrous, I chose to believe in something greater. "I've seen your lie," I said aloud, my voice echoing through the chamber. "I've seen how you've corrupted faith itself, turned prayer into food and devotion into chains. But faith isn't a building or a ritual or an institution. It's not something you can capture or control or corrupt. As my blood touched the altar, cracks began to spread across its surface like lightning frozen in stone. The 13 cardinals recoiled, their golden threads beginning to unravel. Pope Innocent VIII screamed, a sound like ripping metal, as chains that had held him for centuries began to creak and strain. Faith is what remains when everything else falls away, I continued, feeling power flowing through the cross I had carved into my flesh. It's what survives when institutions crumble and leaders prove false and everything you thought you knew turns to ash. You can't corrupt genuine faith because it doesn't belong to you. It never did. The chamber began to shake as if the very foundations of the Vatican were coming apart. The obsidian altar cracked open like an egg, releasing centuries of trapped screams and corrupted prayers into the air. The 13 cardinals began to age rapidly, their preserved forms crumbling to dust as the power that had sustained them for centuries finally failed. But even as their physical forms disintegrated, I heard their final words echoing in my mind. You think you've won, but you've only freed us from our burden. The covenant remains, written in blood and bone and the very stones of this place. Others will come to take our place, as they always have. The vigil will continue. The last thing I saw before the chamber collapsed was my reflection in the altar's broken surface. But now there were two of me, the Thomas who had entered this place, and the Thomas who had been waiting here for centuries. As the ceiling came down, both versions reached out toward each other, and I felt something fundamental rip in the fabric of reality itself. I awoke in Giani Hospital 3 days later with no memory of how I had gotten there. The doctors said I had been found in St. Peter's Square during the height of the storm, unconscious and suffering from severe hypothermia. My equipment was destroyed, my notes gone, my phone wiped clean. When I asked about Father Giani Moretti, the staff looked at me with confusion. No priest by that name had ever worked at the Vatican. Church records showed no trace of his existence. It was as if he had been consumed completely, erased from reality as punishment for his role in my discovery. But here's what they couldn't erase, what they couldn't touch no matter how powerful their patron might be. The cross carved into my palm remained, a permanent scar that occasionally burned with cold fire. And sometimes in mirrors or reflective surfaces, I could see both versions of myself, the one who had escaped and the one who was still down there, still serving the vigil. My research into Brother Francesco Toretti now yielded nothing. Online searches returned no results. Historical databases showed no record of his existence, and the trial transcripts I had read were gone from every archive. My published articles about Vatican corruption had vanished from newspaper websites as if they had never been written. I tried to return to normal journalism, but I found myself drawn to stories that others wouldn't touch. Missing Vatican personnel, unexplained disappearances near religious sites, ancient artifacts that surfaced in private collections before vanishing again. And late at night, when Rome's storms returned with unusual violence, I could hear something calling from deep beneath the city. Not the entity I had faced. That thing was older than sound, older than language. This was something else. The voice of my other self, the Thomas who had remained behind to take up the vigil. He whispers to me through the scar on my palm, telling me about the new 13, who have taken the place of the old ones. About how the covenant adapts, evolves, finds new ways to feed on human faith. About how my act of defiance didn't destroy the system. It only forced it to evolve. The Catholic Church continues to function exactly as it always has. Masses are celebrated, confessions are heard, prayers are offered. But now I know where those prayers really go, what answers them in the darkness beneath St. Peter's throne. And I know that someday, when the storms grow strong enough, and my will finally breaks under the weight of terrible knowledge, I'll return to that chamber. Not because I'm forced to, but because the burden of knowing the truth about faith itself will become too heavy to bear alone. The cross on my palm serves as both protection and prison. As long as my faith remains genuine, as long as I continue to believe despite everything I've seen, the entity can't claim me completely. But faith is a fragile thing, especially when you know that every prayer you offer feeds something that should not exist. Sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, I catch myself wondering if it would be easier to just give in, to take my place among the 13, and let someone else carry the weight of this knowledge. The temptation grows stronger each night, and I know that eventually, inevitably, I'll make the same choice that Brother Francesco Toretti made centuries ago. But for now, I resist. For now, I endure. And I tell this story to anyone who will listen, because someone needs to know the truth about what lurks beneath the marble and gold of humanity's most sacred spaces. The Vatican's greatest secret isn't hidden in archives or locked behind vault doors. It's carved into the very foundations of faith itself, written in a language of blood and silence that speaks to something far older than any god humans have ever worshipped. The cross on my palm is burning again, hotter than it's ever burned before. I can hear my other self calling from the depths, his voice growing stronger with each passing night. The storms are returning to Rome with unprecedented fury, and I know my time is running short. I've told you this story because someone needs to know the truth before I join the vigil permanently. Someone needs to carry the burden of this knowledge forward, to make the same impossible choice I've been making every night for 3 months. The package will arrive soon. You'll know it by the smell of old parchment and grave dirt, by the way it feels warm to the touch despite having no living source of heat. When it does, remember what I've told you. Remember that faith is stronger than institutions, that truth survives even when everything else crumbles to dust. And remember that somewhere beneath the Vatican, in chambers that exist outside the normal flow of time, 13 figures maintain their eternal vigil, keeping something contained that should never be free. The thunder is getting closer now. I can feel my other self reaching across the space between us, his sewn mouth trying to speak my name. It's time for me to go home.